Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share encounters with obscure cryptids and strange creatures, which includes a story that's a little bit different from what I normally do. These stories include an encounter with a strange beast in an orchard, one of the most bizarre stories I've done involving a humanoid encounter in Canada, a shadow creature in the Appalachian Mountains, and an imaginary friend that might be not so imaginary after all. But first, we start with a more familiar cryptid with stories that are hard to come by, and that is an encounter with the Goatman of Bowie, Maryland. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from Bowie, Maryland, where the original poster, or OP, had an encounter with what he believes to be the Goatman of Bowie, Maryland. Bowie, according to the OP, is a suburb of Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. It was established in the late 1800s or early 1900s as a railroad town. Reports of the Goatman in and around the town date back to its establishment. The night of his encounter, the OP was hanging out with his friend in a spot they hung out in growing up, walking the railroad tracks and in the woods, usually going there to smoke and drink. There is a parking lot there with a strip of land separating it from the railroad tracks that is covered with grass and trees. It spans the 30 or so feet between the parking lot and the railroad tracks. The OP and his friend had gone out there to have a cigarette and were standing on the railroad tracks facing the parking lot. There is an overpass that goes over the tracks to their left, but the OP's attention was drawn to the right for reasons he cannot quite explain. He says he was overcome with the strangest feeling and didn't realize until later that it was the feeling of being watched. He says he has never felt it before and likens it to being watched by a predator. They were there for a few more minutes and were almost done with their cigarette when a helicopter flew overhead from the direction of the overpass, shining a spotlight that went right over the boys. The OP says not even 10 seconds later he heard the movement of gravel under the tracks and looked toward the overpass to see a massive silhouette standing there. The being, whatever it was concealed by the darkness created by the overpass, so the OP couldn't make out any of its features, but says it looked to be about 8 to 9 feet tall and extremely burly. He and his friend looked at this hulking being for a mere few seconds before deciding it was time to get out of there. They started running as they heard footsteps on the gravel behind them, with whatever this thing was moving closer. And then they heard, as the OP describes, the most demonic, horrifying, multiple-pitched screech directly behind them. No more than a foot behind their heads, he says. This prompted them to get to the car even faster than they were already moving, and neither of them dared to look back. They eventually got out of there and drove around for about an hour, unable to fully comprehend what they saw. About a week later, they were hanging out with another of their friends, who told them the cops had been out there that night searching the woods because of reports of a woman screaming bloody murder. It turned out that they had a helicopter flying in the area and was the same night the OP and his friend encountered what they believed to be the Goatman of Bowie, Maryland. They told their friend what they saw and he was like, "Yeah, you saw the Goatman." One commenter told of his own experiences in that part of Maryland, backing up the story of the Goatman in the area. He tells about how he and his friends would visit a bridge they had dubbed Crybaby Bridge back in the 60s where they would take people to try and scare them. He says years later he was home from deployment in Vietnam and having drinks with his friends when the topic of the Goatman came up. Every one of them admitted to being really spooked when they visited the bridge, and all of them either heard something or saw something, but everyone had that feeling of being watched by something there. I've always said in these stories that it makes them more credible when there is a second witness there with the OP to see what they are seeing. But to have a complete stranger back them up, especially on the internet, it just adds even more credibility to this one for me. It would seem the Goatman is well known in the area with stories and sightings dating back to the town's establishment, according to the OP. In the comments, the OP and some other users seemed to think that this thing was being territorial due to the fact it got so close to the boys but let them get away. I'm pretty sure being that close to the boys, it could have reached out and grabbed them if it wanted to. This is common in these stories where people get chased. But let's be honest, if these cryptids do grab and kill people, they aren't exactly around to tell their stories. So the only ones we do hear are where the people escape from these encounters. What do you think about this one? Do you think the OP and his friend encountered the Goatman of Bowie, Maryland? The next story comes from a poster who saw a creature in an orange grove one night. He does not say where exactly his story takes place, just that he worked on an olive farm in Northern California at the time and that it was Native American land. The area where the original poster worked and lived was in a very rural location. He describes where the olive farm was as being a beautiful valley with a lot of organic farms, wild rivers, and tons of wildlife. The OP says he would be at work, and every now and then in the middle of the day or at night the air would be filled with an electricity. He describes it as being like a static hanging right above him. He could feel it, especially on the back of his neck, and says he could even somewhat taste it. Every time this would happen, he was overcome with a sense of dread and became very anxious. This would lead to him ending his day early and heading home. But there was one night when he was out in the orchard finishing his work for the day when the static filled the air. He finished up and was heading home when he saw a monstrous being running through the neighbor's orange grove. He describes it as being a huge, black, bristly creature walking on two legs. He says the static was so intense when he saw this thing that he had a metallic, almost blood-like taste in his mouth. He says in response to a comment that it was almost like he was eating a battery, and that he was overcome with an intense fear in that moment. He wasted no time gunning his car and getting home as fast as he could. I've heard stories where the person having the encounter describes weird smells and tastes during their encounter, but I must say static charge hanging in the air is a new one to me. It is really fascinating how this phenomenon that affects smell and taste happens when these beings are near. There are theories out there ranging from the smell emanating from the creature itself to being an after effect of a portal opening and/or closing. In any case, and I know the OP was probably thinking this after seeing this creature, that it was close by every time he started to feel the static in the air. Perhaps it was farther away though, being that he only tasted what he did when he was close to it. I'm glad he had the good sense to get out of there on the days and nights when this happened and the feeling of dread came over him. It might have saved him from being caught out in a field or orchard with this thing. If I did unfortunately see something like this, I would want it to be from the relative safety of my car as well, so I could do exactly what he did, gun it and get out of there. As for what this thing could have been, he mentions in his telling of the story a dog, a pig, a bear, or even a man. Now I know what you South Park fans are going to say, and someone definitely said it in the comments, that this was Man Bear Pig. I don't think the OP meant it was part dog, part pig, part bear, and part human. I think these are just the things that ran through his head when he got a brief glimpse of this creature. What caught my attention was when he said it looked like a dog or a bear. This could mean it was a Dogman or even a Sasquatch. What throws me off a little is him describing it as being bristly. This could be used to describe a Dogman's coat, I'm guessing. This is all speculation on my part, however. What do you think he saw that night? The next story comes to us from Manitoba, Canada, from a poster who relays a story told to her by her grandfather about a couple who encountered a humanoid being with the wife, to this day having never been the same. This story also contains the mention of a cryptid I had not heard of before, with one commenter saying what happened to the wife is similar to what he has heard about this obscure cryptid. The original poster says she has never had the platform to share her grandfather's story, but came across a forum where users shared their encounters with humanoid beings, and figured it was the perfect place to tell the tale. The story takes place near the Sandy Bay Aboriginal Reserve in the 1960s. The grandfather was friends with a couple who had a cabin on the reserve and had traveled there for a visit and arrived on a snowy night. They were carrying their luggage to the cabin and saw a very bright light shining inside the cabin. The entire interior of the cabin was illuminated by what the husband describes as a fluorescent icy blue color. He also says he and his wife thought they saw the silhouette of a humanoid figure within the cabin. It was lanky and very tall, standing there by itself before walking out of sight. The couple rushed into the cabin to check things out, searching the entire place, but found nothing. The wife went back out to retrieve more luggage from the car when her husband heard her scream. He ran outside to find her standing in the woods about 25 feet from the car, distraught, yelling and screaming. He ran out to her to find that her eyes were glazed over. This all happened in the span of about 20 to 30 seconds. The most bizarre thing about this scene, however, was that the husband saw her footprints in the snow leading to the car, but there were no footprints or tracks leading out to where she was standing in the woods. If she had walked out into the woods on her own, there would have been tracks leading to the spot. Unfortunately, her condition never relinquished and she was admitted to a mental hospital not long after, and she has been there ever since, with the same glossy-eyed look. She still cannot speak. Whatever she encountered at the cabin horribly traumatized her, and the husband, grandfather, and OP believe it has something to do with the humanoid figure they saw standing in the cabin. The OP's grandfather still talks to the husband and once visited the wife in the hospital, but due to how far away he lives, he was only able to visit on the one occasion. The OP ends her post asking for anyone to leave their theories about what happened to her in the comments. The very first comment came from a user who says he is Cree Manitoban. He says the story reminds him of a cryptid known as the Manigeshi, with stories he has heard about the people involved never being the same after encountering one. The Manigeshi is a cryptid and myth of the Cree natives of Canada. They are described as a race of trickster people. The Dover Demon is said to be one of these creatures and a more modern sighting of the beings. They are said to live between rocks in the rapids, and one of their biggest delights is brawling out of the rocks and capsizing canoes of people canoeing through the rapids, spinning them to their deaths. Now I know this doesn't exactly line up with this story, but the commenter said he gets that vibe, and being that it takes place in Manitoba, who's to say for certain? There is speculation in the comments that the woman was abducted by something or pulled into another dimension, and what she went through lasted a lot longer than the 20 to 30 seconds it took her husband to run outside and find her standing in the woods with no footsteps leading up to her. Their theory is whatever took her brought her back and left her in that spot rather than where she was originally standing. This may seem a little far-fetched to some, but there are theories suggesting that cryptids and what are referred to as aliens, but commonly called greys, are interdimensional beings, and that is why in some stories they are there one second and seemingly vanish without a trace the next. In any case, what happened to the wife in this story is tragic. What do you think happened to her? The next story comes to us from a poster who saw what he describes as a shadow creature late one night. He isn't sure if it belongs among cryptid stories, but posted it alongside them to see if anyone had seen anything similar. He does not say where his story takes place, just that he lived in Appalachia at the time. This is an area of the Appalachian Mountain range that begins in southern New York and stretches through a sizable portion of Pennsylvania, parts of Maryland and Ohio, includes all of West Virginia, and covers a lot of ground in Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Alabama, and some of South Carolina and Georgia before ending in Mississippi. The original poster's encounter, which took place 2 years before he posted it, happened on a fishing trip with his friend. The friend was moving to Florida, and the two decided to take one last trip to go catfishing before he left. Their spot was on a river, and the night turned out to be a poor one for fishing as they didn't catch anything. So they started heading for home at around 2 or 3 in the morning, and on their return trip they ran into some fog. The OP says he specifically remembers this because he was smoking a stogie while his friend was half asleep in the passenger seat. The OP looked down briefly to change the song on his phone, and when he returned his eyes to the road, he saw what he says can only be described as a shadow being. It was tall and stood upright on 2 legs and had no discernible color or details. It was just a black void, says the OP, in the shape of an upright silhouette right in front of his headlight. But there was still no detail to this being. It was running across the road in front of him, and the OP says it was moving at such a high speed that it smacked the weeds and tall grass just off the road, resulting in a sound so loud it sent a chill down his spine. His friend was conscious enough to see this thing too, and the OP and him talked about it briefly, just long enough for them both to confirm that they had indeed witnessed it. The OP hasn't seen anything like it since that night. He ends his post by saying he would love some insight on the thing he saw running across the road that night. I know a shadow creature isn't technically a cryptid, but this one shares some similarities to some of the stories I cover on this channel. Also, there are cryptids such as Dogman that are usually described as being blacker than night, so much so that they even stand out in complete darkness. I've heard that over and over in Dogman stories I hear, read, and tell on this channel. It could be that the creature was moving so fast that it just looked like a shadow due to how dark it was. Or it very well could have been a shadow creature as described by the OP. This is just speculation on my part. The speed in which it moved reminded me of a cryptid, and it has a physical form due to it running into the tall grass and weeds on the side of the road to produce the spine-chilling sound. Cryptids are commonly described as moving at very high speeds, just like in this story. However, without a more detailed description, it is impossible to say what this thing could have been. All I know is that if I was riding at night in the fog and saw something like this, I would be driving only in the daytime for a long time after that. Luckily, they didn't see this thing again that night, haven't seen it since, and made it out of there without further incident. What do you think about this one? Have any ideas what this creature could have been? The final story of this episode is different from what I normally do on this channel, but I received an email from a viewer detailing their imaginary friend. Or rather, maybe a not so imaginary friend. I'd like to thank Wisteria for sharing their story with me and allowing me to share it on my channel. This isn't your typical cryptid story, but I like to do different things here from time to time, and this story hit kind of close to home for me. I will tell you why after I share it. It reads as follows. When I was a child, my home life wasn't good. It was a violent place without love. That meant I spent most of my time alone. One day when I was around 6, I, quote, invented an imaginary friend to deal with my life, or at least I thought that's what I did. One day I noticed this strange creature in my home. It was only about 2 feet tall. It was furry with long claws and big sharp teeth. It had fluffy pointed ears like a cat's ears. There was no tail that I remember. It could have had a bobbed tail or something like that, but nothing that stands out in my memory. Those eyes and teeth are the things I really remember. It was a super dark purple. It had large yellow eyes. At night in the dark or dim light, the creature looked black. It could stand on 2 feet, but mostly ran around on 4 feet. It moved and acted like a cat. It never spoke words, but did growl and grunt. Despite the language barrier, I always knew what he wanted or was trying to say. He stayed with me for many years and never caused any problems. He slept with me and went everywhere with me, but I was the only one who could see him. My family didn't seem that interested in my stories about him. He disappeared when I got older and I didn't think about him again. That was until last year. I got around to watching the TV series Supernatural. For those that don't know, it's a show where a pair of brothers hunt supernatural creatures. There was an episode about imaginary friends. At the mention of imaginary friends, I remembered my little friend and drew a picture of him. I had always labeled him as a hobgoblin, so that's what I said he was. My teenage son thought my description was a bit odd and started researching it. After a while, he came up with the term Talipo. It's a mythological cat-like creature that lives in the Appalachian Mountains. As soon as he showed me drawings and artwork, I knew right away that was the thing that had been my best friend for years. It didn't make sense, but as crazy as it sounded, that seemed to be the only answer. At this point, I know some, if not most of you, are wondering what the heck is a Talipo. Well, it is an urban legend told in and near the Appalachian Mountains. It is about a creature who has its tail removed and comes back looking for it. It is usually described with big bright eyes and sharp teeth. To give you more detail, I will tell you the story, or at least a version of it, as it has many variations. But first, I do want to point out why Wisteria's story hit so close to home for me. When I would visit my great-grandmother growing up, she would often tell me the story of the Talipo. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to include this story in an episode on my channel. However, she would always include a much lighter, sometimes even funny ending to the story so as not to scare me, as the original tale is much, much darker. The story of the Talipo is as follows. Nana, this one is for you. The story begins during a time of near famine with a man and his 3 hounds living out in the middle of nowhere. There is very little game to hunt, which means little food for the man and his dogs. He is out one night hunting for his evening meal and manages to shoot a small rabbit, which he shares with his dogs. But it does little to sate either his or his dog's hunger, so he continues onward looking for another course to his meal. As he presses on, he discovers a bizarre shape with bright eyes and a long tail. He aims and quickly shoots at the creature, severing its tail. Screaming, the creature runs off into the darkness, and being that he is starving, the man eats the tail, usually in a stew. He then returns to his cabin and goes to bed. But when he is about to fall asleep, a rustling and clawing wakes him. He then sits up to see the bright gleaming eyes of the Talipo leering at him from the foot of his bed. In an otherworldly voice, the creature demands the return of its tail, saying, "Talipo, Talipo, I want my Talipo." Terrified, the man calls for his hounds, which immediately come and chase the beast into the dark forest. After a while, everything quiets down and the Talipo is perceived to be gone. However, only 2 of the man's dogs return. The man tries to go back to sleep, but the Talipo soon returns, beckoning even more forcefully for the return of its tail. "Talipo, Talipo, I want my Talipo." Again, the man sticks his hounds on the Talipo, and again they chase it into the dark forest. However, this time only 1 dog comes back. Unable to sleep, the man clutches his gun and waits for dawn, keeping his last dog close to him. When the Talipo eventually appears for a 3rd time, the man once again orders the hound to attack it. It does so, chasing it off, but does not return. The man, having lost his 3 hounds and now having no protection except his gun, cowers under his blankets and sheets, praying for dawn. Hours before daybreak, the man hears the familiar rustling sound and hopes it's one of his dogs. Unfortunately, it is not. The Talipo leaps onto him, causing him to drop his gun in terror. The beast, now eye to eye with the man, says one more time, "Talipo, Talipo, I want my Talipo." The man, of course, is unable to oblige. What happens next depends on the variation of the story. The man is either torn to shreds by the creature, or nothing but the chimney is left standing in the aftermath of what happens. In either case, or however else the story ends, the Talipo exacts revenge for the loss of his tail. The story is usually left with the creature roaming the darkness, either calling for the return of its tail or saying, "Talipo, Talipo, now I've got my Talipo." Now, obviously, Wisteria's interaction with the creature that looked almost identical to the Talipo was nowhere near as terrifying as this original story, and it could be said that it was just an imaginary friend. But for it to look so much like this creature is a big coincidence, especially being that Wisteria had never heard this story growing up in the Appalachian Mountains. Ever since I got into cryptid stories, I hear the myths and urban legends surrounding many of them. I often wonder if those legends could be true encounters or stories created based on actual encounters with certain types of cryptids long ago and passed down through generations, being changed and added to along the way. If I had to venture a guess, it would be that these myths and urban legends are just based on actual encounters. For example, I will use Dogman. Many people who have never heard of Dogman think they have seen a werewolf, and many describe it as looking just like one. Now, who is to say Dogman hasn't been around all along and the werewolf legend, myth, or whatever else you want to call it is based on the cryptid, albeit with the exaggeration of a human transforming into the beast. That could have been added somewhere along the way. That's just my personal theory anyway, so take it for what it's worth. I also want to mention, in searching for a version of this story to tell, I did see where people claimed to have encountered the Talipo. So who knows? Maybe I'll have a full episode dedicated to the creature in the future. What do you think about Wisteria's imaginary friend? Do you believe it to be just a coincidence that it looked almost identical to the Talipo, or could there be more to the story? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.